Europe was never really about romance. Forget fairy tales, forget candlelit serenades. Royal marriage was basically the medieval version of LinkedIn, a series of calculated alliances, backroom handshakes, and endorsements in the form of cousin weddings. For peasants, love might have meant finding someone who wouldn't cough blood on your soup or leave you for a monastery. For royals, love was a spreadsheet, a family spreadsheet that kept getting tighter and tighter until the cells started collapsing on themselves. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let's be clear. Europe was literally built on cousin marriages. Kings and queens were obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, as if they were some divine Pokemon cards that would lose value if mixed with outsiders. In reality, this purity obsession didn't preserve their power. It sabotaged their own genes, their heirs, and eventually their empires. Why cousin marriages? Let's cut them some slack for a second. To a medieval king, cousin marriage looked like a genius strategy. Because 1. Land consolidation. If your daughter married a stranger, some farmland might walk out the door with her dowry. But if she married her cousin, congratulations, the land stayed in the family. Incest, cheaper than lawyers. 2. Dynastic alliances. Want to stop a war? Marry your cousin. Want to start a war? Marry your cousin. Want to end a feud between two branches of the family? Just shuffle some cousins around. At this point, half of European politics was basically Tinder, but with more swords and less swiping. 3. The divine blood illusion. Royals convinced themselves they weren't just humans, they were chosen by God. Mixing that holy blood with common stock? Unthinkable. Better to marry your niece than let a blacksmith's genes contaminate your heavenly DNA. The result? A genetic echo chamber that kept bouncing the same mutations around until Europe was populated by kings with jaws like construction equipment, queens who couldn't have children, and heirs who made medical textbooks look like family portraits. Here's the ironic part. The Catholic Church technically forbade marriages between close kin. By close, they meant up to the 7th degree, which included basically everyone in a small intermarried elite. But rules are only rules if you don't have a pope on speed dial. Need an exception? Boom, papal dispensation. As long as your gold kept flowing into Rome, the church was more than happy to sign off on your wedding to cousin Maria or Uncle Philip. By the 16th century, it was basically, want to marry your niece? That'll be 200 ducats and a lifetime supply of incense. Next, the Inbreeding Hall of Fame. Before we zoom in on the disasters, looking at you, Charles II, let's take a tour of Europe's greatest hits in cousin love. The Habsburgs, the undisputed champions. They made cousin marriage a brand. Their motto could have been, Austria's lucky in love because we marry our relatives. The Bourbons, France's answer to how many cousins can we marry before the revolution starts. The Ptolemies. Okay, technically not European, but they inspired the trend. Cleopatra's family basically turned incest into a family pastime. Brother-sister marriages, standard, cousin unions, entry level. The British royals, later adopters. But don't worry, Queen Victoria made up for lost time by spreading hemophilia through half the continent, like it was her personal party favour. Imagine being a royal teenager in the 1500s Spain. Hormones raging, you're doodling hearts in the margins of your illuminated manuscript. But instead of daydreaming about the mysterious stable boy, your parents slide over a portrait of your pale, slightly drooling cousin. Meet your future husband, darling. He's family, literally, very literally. You'd think the kids would revolt, but nope. The system was so entrenched that marrying outside the bloodline wasn't just frowned upon, it was politically suicidal. You'd be the idiot who gave your family a healthy heir, but lost them Bavaria in the process. The irony? This obsession with pure blood created the most fragile heirs in history. Each marriage was like photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy. At first, it looked fine. By the 5th generation, the ink was smudged. By the 10th, you had Charles II of Spain, a man whose jaw could open wine bottles but couldn't chew solid food. And these weren't just personal tragedies. These medical disasters shaped entire wars and dynastic collapses. When Charles II died without an heir, it didn't just mean awkward palace silence. It sparked the War of Spanish Succession, dragging half of Europe into chaos. So let's be clear. Europe wasn't shaped by great leaders with vision. It was shaped by horny cousins and desperate kings with too much faith in papal paperwork. The result? Dynasties that self-destructed, heirs who could barely function, and empires that collapsed under the weight of their own DNA. And the most infamous case, the poster child of inbreeding gone wrong, is next. Cue the Habsburgs, cue Spain, cue the man historians politely call the Bewitched. If you thought the idea of cousin marriages sounded like a bad punchline, the Habsburgs turned it into a lifestyle brand. These people didn't just dabble in family weddings, they industrialized them. Forget Game of Thrones. The Habsburgs were running Game of Clones, and the final product was a king so medically cursed that historians basically had to invent new adjectives to describe him. Meet Charles II of Spain, nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, which sounds kinda cool until you realise it wasn't because he was magical. It was because people genuinely thought he was cursed, and honestly, when you look at his life, you can't blame them. Charles was born in 1661, the end product of 200 years of Habsburgs practicing cousin-on-cousin romance like it was an Olympic sport. His father, Philip IV, married his niece. His grandparents, cousins. His great-grandparents, more cousins. If you mapped Charles's family tree, it would look less like a tree and more like a poorly tied shoelace. The result? Charles was a genetic Frankenstein's monster, stitched together not by ambition but by papal dispensations and awkward family dinners. His famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that chewing food was basically an extreme sport. He had difficulty speaking clearly, which made diplomacy awkward. Sorry, what did the king just say? Did he declare war or order more wine? He suffered from developmental delays. He didn't learn to walk until he was 4, and he wasn't fully literate until adulthood. He was chronically ill, weak, and infertile, which, by the way, is a bit of a problem when your entire job is to produce an heir. If Charles had been a random farm boy in Castile, people might have shrugged. But he was the king of Spain, the empire that had once controlled half the known world. And suddenly, the empire's survival rested on a man who could barely digest dinner without assistance. The funny, or tragic as part, is that you can literally see the Habsburg decline in their portraits. Early Habsburgs, sharp, noble, handsome in that vaguely, we just conquered Europe way. By Charles's time, the painters were basically doing Photoshop on canvas, desperately trying to minimise his jawline while still being accurate enough not to get executed. But even artistic airbrushing couldn't hide the truth. This was a man falling apart at the genetic seams, and everyone in Europe was watching. You'd think one weak king wouldn't be a big deal. Monarchies had weak rulers all the time, but Charles had no children. None. 0. He married twice, both times to young, healthy women, and neither produced an heir. Whispers spread across Europe that he was impotent, cursed, or both. Doctors were called in. They prescribed tonics, herbs, and even exorcisms. Yes, people thought his infertility might be demonic. One report claimed his semen was like cold water, not the kind of medical note you want preserved in the archives. Spain's greatest empire, the one that had gold pouring in from the Americas, armies across Europe, and colonies around the world, now hinged on a king who couldn't eat solid food or produce a child. The Habsburg genetic gamble was coming due, and the house was losing. The collapse. When Charles finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, his body was so deteriorated that the autopsy read like a horror story. One account claimed he had the heart of a shrimp, the lungs of a rooster, and a head full of water. I wish I were making that up. His death didn't just mean awkward funeral arrangements, it meant the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, no heir, no backup plan. And when the most powerful throne in Europe suddenly goes vacant, you don't get a peaceful transition, you get chaos. The result? The War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Half of Europe jumped in like vultures over a carcass. France, Austria, England, the Dutch, and basically anyone with an army started fighting over who got to sit on Spain's empty throne. Think about that. One man's inability to produce a child triggered a war that dragged on for over a decade, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and redrew the map of Europe. That's the legacy of royal inbreeding. Not just weird jaws and awkward family portraits, but full-blown continental wars. Here's the kicker. The Habsburgs didn't learn from this. Even as Spain collapsed, their Austrian cousins kept the cousin marriage tradition alive. The Austrian Habsburgs would eventually keep marrying within the family until Maria Theresa, 18th century, decided maybe, just maybe, it was time to outsource the DNA a little. But by then, the damage was already baked into the dynasty's history. In fact, geneticists today have studied the Habsburg family tree and found something remarkable. Charles II's parents were so closely related that their genetic relationship was basically the same as if siblings had married. That's not just cousin marriage, that's hitting fast forward on genetic collapse. But here's where the story spirals outward, because the Habsburgs weren't the only ones mixing up their gene pool like it was a closed cocktail party. The French Bourbons dabbled in it, the British royals weren't innocent either, and Queen Victoria, she basically turned cousin marriage into a family export business, sending out hemophilia like it was her personal wedding gift. So if Spain was the poster child of inbreeding collapse, the rest of Europe was the fine print, and the consequences, from bleeding princes to mad kings, would ripple through history in ways just as dramatic. Spain may have given us Charles II as the mascot of inbreeding, but don't think for a second that the rest of Europe was sitting around judging from the sidelines. Nope. They were too busy marrying their own cousins and quietly sowing the seeds of their own disasters. Queen Victoria, the great genetic exporter. Fast forward to the 19th century. Britain by then was the global superpower. The sun never set on the British Empire. Tea was practically a religion, and at the centre of it all was Queen Victoria, short, stubborn, and deeply in love with her cousin, Prince Albert. Yes, cousin, of course. Because what's a throne without a family reunion wedding? Now, Victoria and Albert genuinely had one of the more wholesome royal love stories. But genetically, they were the typhoid Mary of European royalty. Together they produced 9 children, who were married off across the continent like diplomatic chess pieces. By the time Victoria was done, she was nicknamed the Grandmother of Europe. Sweet, right? Except, along with tiaras and titles, she also exported a nasty little genetic gift, hemophilia. Hemophilia, in case you skipped biology, is a blood disorder where you can bleed to death from a paper cut. It spread like wildfire through Victoria's descendants. Her son Leopold had it, her grandsons in Spain and Germany had it, and most famously Tsarevich Alexei of Russia had it, the heir to the Romanov throne. Imagine being the crown prince of one of the largest empires on earth, and your own blood couldn't clot. That's not just a personal health crisis. That's a dynasty with a ticking time bomb built into its veins. Russia! Rasputin's opening. This is where things get juicy. Alexei's haemophilia turned into a political earthquake. Every time he got injured, he risked bleeding out. His parents, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, were desperate, and desperation opens doors for characters. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the bearded mystic, drunk and alleged sex wizard who somehow convinced the royal family he could heal Alexei through prayer. Doctors couldn't fix haemophilia. Science was still fumbling around with leeches, but Rasputin? He shows up, whispers a few prayers, and the boy stabilizes. Coincidence? Maybe. Miracle? To the Tsarina, yes. And just like that, Rasputin slithered his way into the heart of Russian politics. The nobility hated him, the church distrusted him, and the common people gossiped endlessly. But Alexandra clung to him like a drowning woman to driftwood. Why? Because the royal bloodline was fragile and she'd do anything to keep her son alive. The irony. That fragile inbred bloodline was part of what dragged the Romanovs down. Rasputin's influence discredited the monarchy, fueled revolutionary anger, and became one more domino leading to the Russian Revolution of 1917. So yes, Queen Victoria's cousin marriage and genetic jackpot played a direct role in Russia becoming the Soviet Union. One cousin marriage in 1840, and boom, Lenin in 1917. Butterfly effect, royal edition. France. Madness in the blood. Across the border in France, the Bourbons weren't exactly paragons of genetic wisdom either. They had centuries of cousin marriages keeping titles nice and tight, and the results occasionally burst through the seams in spectacular fashion. Take Charles VI of France, nicknamed Charles the Mad. At first, he was a decent king. Then, somewhere in his 20s, the family genes kicked in like a bad hangover. He started having psychotic breaks. Once, he attacked his own knights during a procession, convinced they were plotting against him. Another time, he refused to bathe because he thought water would kill him. But my favourite. Charles was convinced he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He wore reinforced clothing so he wouldn't shatter if someone bumped into him. Imagine running a country while believing you might explode into shards like a wine goblet. This wasn't just embarrassing dinner party material. His instability weakened the monarchy, fanned the flames of the 100 Years' War, and nearly tore France apart. All because the family tree had been folded one too many times. By now, the pattern should be obvious. Spain collapses under Charles II. France stumbles through madness and revolution. Russia bleeds out with hemophilia. Britain exports genetic disasters like they're handing out Empire starter packs. The thread weaving all of this together? An obsession with blood purity so extreme it became self-destructive. Kings and queens were terrified of marrying outsiders, terrified of losing their divine aura, terrified of being common. So they locked themselves in genetic cages, and then acted surprised when the cages collapsed. Let's tally the receipts, shall we? Spain. Charles II's infertility triggers the War of Spanish Succession. Hundreds of thousands dead. France. Generations of weak heirs and unstable kings lead to revolution and guillotines. Russia. Hemophilia leads to Rasputin, which leads to revolution, which leads to the end of the Romanovs. Britain. Got lucky with constitutional monarchy, but still managed to seed disaster in other countries through Victoria's children. These weren't isolated tragedies, they were turning points in history, and they all trace back to royal inbreeding. The grand joke of history, royals obsessed over protecting their bloodlines. They thought they were securing their divine right to rule forever. But in reality, their strategy guaranteed their own extinction. They collapsed not because peasants stormed the gates out of nowhere, but because their heirs were too fragile, too infertile, or too insane to keep the show running. Europe wasn't shaped by visionaries. It was shaped by jaws that couldn't close properly, blood that wouldn't clot, and minds that shattered like glass. So the next time you see a royal portrait, the silks, the crowns, the polished image of divine authority, remember this. Behind that canvas might be a king who thought he was made of glass, a queen who couldn't produce an heir, or a prince who could bleed to death from a nosebleed. Crowns weren't built on glory, they were built on cousin marriages, and the price wasn't just deformities, it was wars, revolutions, and the collapse of empires. Which dynasty do you think paid the highest price for its obsession with pure blood? The Spanish Habsburgs, the French Bourbons, or the Russian Romanovs?